The Maryland Eastern Shore in 1822 was a landscape of contradictions, breathtaking natural beauty concealing unspeakable human cruelty. Fertile soil watered by the sweat and blood of people who would never own the land they worked. Skies of infinite blue stretching above souls trapped in bondage that seemed equally infinite. Into this world of stolen freedom and calculated dehumanization, a child was born who would become a legend, though the name given to her at birth was simply Araminta Ross, called Minty by those who loved her. She entered a world that considered her property before it considered her human, that assigned her monetary value before it acknowledged her possession of a soul, that planned her future as forced labor before she had taken her first breath. Her mother, Harriet Green, known as Rit, was a woman of profound strength masked by necessary submission, a woman who had borne 9 children into slavery and watched several of them sold away to destinations unknown, their small hands torn from hers by the economic logic of human trafficking. Rit had learned to survive by appearing obedient while maintaining a fierce interior life, a private space of dignity and resistance that no master could touch. Her father, Ben Ross, was a skilled timber inspector who possessed knowledge of the woods and waterways that would one day prove invaluable to his daughter's mission. A man whose intelligence was employed in the service of someone else's profit, but never truly owned by anyone but himself. Young Minty grew up in the slave quarters of the Broadest plantation, in a world where childhood was a luxury measured in months rather than years, where children as young as 5 or 6 were put to work at tasks their small bodies could barely manage. She learned early that showing intelligence was dangerous. Enslaved people who seemed too smart, too aware, too capable of independent thought were either sold south to the killing fields of the cotton plantations or subjected to increased surveillance and cruelty designed to break their spirits before those spirits could imagine freedom. But Minty possessed something that couldn't be beaten out of her, couldn't be sold away, couldn't be suppressed by any amount of brutality, an unshakable sense of her own humanity, a bone-deep certainty that she was a person, not property, that she was born for freedom, not bondage. This conviction wasn't something she chose, it was something she was, as fundamental to her nature as breathing. At age 5, she was hired out to a woman who wanted her to check muskrat traps in the icy rivers of winter, a task that resulted in Minty contracting measles and suffering permanent damage to her respiratory system. The woman sent her back to the Broadest plantation as useless, a failed investment, but what that cruel woman didn't realize was that Minty had learned something crucial, that her value in the eyes of white people fluctuated based on her utility, and that being considered useless might sometimes offer a form of protection, a way to be overlooked and underestimated. At age 6, she was hired out again, this time to a woman who wanted a nursemaid for her baby. Minty was required to stay awake all night rocking the cradle, and if the baby cried, she was whipped. The scars from those whippings would remain on her back for the rest of her life, a permanent record of cruelty inflicted on a child for the crime of being human and needing sleep. But even as the whip fell, even as her small body endured pain designed to break her, Minty's spirit remained intact, observing, learning, planning for a future she couldn't yet see but somehow knew would come. At age 7, she decided she would rather die than continue to live as she was living. She ran away, hiding in a pig pen for 5 days, fighting the pigs for potato peelings and scraps, enduring hunger and cold and the terror of pursuit, rather than return to the woman who beat her. When she finally returned, driven back by starvation, she discovered something important. She had the courage to run, the will to endure suffering in pursuit of something better, the capacity to choose death over degradation. These early experiences were forming the person she would become, were teaching her lessons that would later save not just her own life, but the lives of hundreds of others.
She was learning the geography of Maryland, the patterns of patrols and searches, the psychology of pursuit and evasion. She was learning that survival sometimes required submission and sometimes required resistance, and that wisdom lay in knowing which was needed when. But she was also learning something more painful, that love in slavery was a form of torture, that caring deeply for others gave the system leverage against you, that every connection was a potential point of vulnerability. Could any child truly prepare for what was coming? Could any amount of suffering, any accumulation of hard-won knowledge ready someone for the impossible choices that lay ahead? When Minty was around 12 or 13 years old, the exact date was uncertain because enslaved people's births were rarely recorded with precision, their existence mattering only as it related to property records. She experienced an event that would change the course of her life and ultimately the course of American history. She was at a dry goods store on an errand when an enslaved man ran into the store, pursued by an overseer, demanding that everyone help capture the fugitive.
Minty refused to assist, and when the enslaved man ran, she positioned herself in the doorway to block the overseer's pursuit. The overseer picked up a 2-pound iron weight and hurled it at the fleeing man. It missed its intended target and struck Minty in the forehead with devastating force. The impact fractured her skull, driving bone fragments into her brain, causing immediate unconsciousness and injuries that should have killed her. She was carried back to the Broadus plantation and laid in her family's cabin, blood pooling beneath her head, her breathing shallow and irregular, her survival so uncertain that her master considered her a total loss and tried unsuccessfully to sell her even in her injured state. For weeks, Minty hovered between life and death. When she finally regained consciousness, she discovered that the injury had left her with permanent effects: severe headaches, sudden episodes where she would fall into deep sleep without warning, seizures that would plague her for the rest of her life. In medical terms, she had suffered traumatic brain injury with resulting narcolepsy and temporal lobe epilepsy. But Minty experienced these episodes differently. She understood them as visions, as moments when she touched something beyond the material world, as gifts from God that allowed her to see paths that others couldn't see. The white world saw her as damaged goods, her value drastically reduced by injuries that made her unreliable for consistent labor. But Minty saw herself as marked by God, chosen for a purpose she didn't yet fully understand. The visions that came during her episodes showed her images of freedom, showed her paths through wilderness, showed her flying over fields and towns like a bird escaping a cage. She began to interpret these visions as divine guidance, as God preparing her for a mission that would require supernatural assistance. During her long recovery, something else shifted inside Minty. The fear that had been a constant companion since childhood, fear of the whip, fear of being sold, fear of the 1,000 daily cruelties that defined enslaved life, began to diminish. When you've nearly died, when you've touched the boundary between life and death and returned, smaller fears lose their power. She began to speak more boldly, to carry herself with a dignity that troubled the white people who encountered her, to develop a reputation as someone who couldn't be fully controlled. Her father, Ben, noticed the change in Minty and began to teach her things he'd kept hidden before. He taught her how to navigate by the stars, how to move silently through the woods at night, how to read weather signs and find food in the wilderness, how to understand the language of birds and animals that might warn of approaching danger. He told her stories of the Underground Railroad in whispers so quiet they were barely audible, told her about people who had escaped to the north, about Quakers and free black people who helped fugitives, about routes and safe houses and the drinking gourd constellation that pointed the way to freedom. "Why are you telling me this?" Minty asked one night as they sat outside their cabin, her father's lessons having taken on an urgency that felt like preparation for something imminent. "Because I see something in you," Ben replied, his voice carrying both pride and sorrow. "I see someone who won't be held by chains, not forever. And when your time comes to go, I want you to have the knowledge you'll need to make it." Minty understood what he wasn't saying, that her escape, when it came, would mean leaving him behind, leaving her mother, leaving her brothers and sisters still in bondage. The thought created an ache in her chest that rivaled the pain from her head injury. But she also understood something else, that freedom, once imagined, becomes an irresistible force. You can't unknow that you deserve it, can't return to accepting bondage once you've truly grasped that you were born to be free. In 1844, when Minty was around 22 years old, she made a decision that reflected both hope and defiance. She married a free black man named John Tubman, taking his surname and changing her first name to Harriet in honor of her mother. The marriage represented a claim to something like a normal life, a gesture toward the possibility of love and partnership, even in circumstances that made such things nearly impossible. But the marriage also revealed a painful truth about the differences between those born free and those born into bondage. John Tubman had never experienced slavery, had never felt the weight of chains or the sting of the whip, had never known the terror of wondering each morning if this would be the day you were sold away from everyone you loved. He couldn't fully understand Harriet's growing obsession with freedom, her talk of escaping north, her visions of liberation that came in her sleeping episodes. When she told him about her plans to escape, he responded with fear rather than support. "You'll be caught," he told her. "You'll be killed, or worse, sold south. Why can't you accept things as they are? I'm free, we're married, isn't that enough?" But it wasn't enough. How could it be enough to be married to a free man while she herself remained property, while her family remained in bondage, while every day she woke up the longing to someone else? The difference in their visions for the future created a distance between them that love couldn't bridge. And when Harriet finally made the decision to run, she knew she would be making it alone. Could any marriage survive the divide between freedom and bondage? Could love flourish when one partner's fundamental humanity was denied by law? The year 1849 brought crisis to Harriet's life in the form of her master Edward Brodess's death. His passing meant that his estate would be settled, his debts paid, his property liquidated, and enslaved people were always the most liquid form of property, the easiest to sell to raise quick cash. Harriet heard rumors that she and her brothers were about to be sold to chain gangs in the Deep South, to the cotton plantations where enslaved people worked until they died, where the mortality rate was so high that it required constant importation of new workers to replace those who perished. The threat was real and immediate. Harriet knew that if she didn't act now, she might never have another chance. She tried to convince her brothers to escape with her, and initially they agreed. But on the night of the escape, as they moved through the darkness toward the first stage of their journey, her brother's nerve failed. The risk seemed too great, the unknown too terrifying, the possibility of success too slim. They insisted on turning back, and Harriet, heartbroken but determined, turned back with them rather than leave them to face punishment alone. But returning didn't make the danger disappear. The sale was still coming, her family was still about to be destroyed, and Harriet realized that if her brothers wouldn't come with her, she would have to go alone. On a September night in 1849, Harriet Tubman made the most difficult decision of her life. She would escape to freedom, leaving behind her husband who wouldn't come with her, her parents who were too old and ill to attempt the journey, her brothers and sisters still in bondage, everything and everyone she had ever known and loved. The pain of this choice cannot be overstated. Harriet wasn't running from her family, she was running to save herself so that she might someday save them. But in the moment of departure, as she slipped away from the cabin where her family slept, the difference between running from and running to must have felt impossibly thin. She had help in the early stages of her escape. A white woman who was part of the Underground Railroad network gave her the names of 2 families who would help her along the route north. But most of the journey, nearly 90 miles from Maryland to Pennsylvania, Harriet traveled alone, guided by the North Star, by the moss that grew on the north sides of trees, by the visions that came in her sleeping episodes and showed her which paths to take. She traveled by night, sleeping in swamps and woods during the day, eating whatever she could forage, drinking from streams, moving through a landscape that was both beautiful and deadly. She was hunted by professional slave catchers who made their living tracking fugitives, by dogs trained to track human scent, by a legal system that considered her theft of herself a crime warranting capture and severe punishment. Every sound might be pursuit. Every stranger might be an informer.
Every decision, which path to take, when to rest, whom to trust, might mean the difference between freedom and recapture, between life and death. But Harriet possessed advantages that her pursuers couldn't see. Her sleeping episodes, which white people saw as disability, she experienced as communion with God, as moments when divine guidance showed her the way. Her intimate knowledge of Maryland's woods and waterways, learned during years of being hired out to various masters, gave her familiarity with terrain that her pursuers had to navigate by map and guesswork. Her determination, forged in childhood suffering and adult conviction, was absolute. She would die before she returned to bondage. And that certainty gave her a kind of fearlessness that confused and unsettled those who encountered her. She walked for weeks, her feet bleeding, her body pushed beyond normal human endurance. She hid in safe houses provided by the Underground Railroad, where Quakers and free black people risked their own safety to shelter her. She disguised herself as a man when necessary, as an old woman when that seemed safer, adapting her appearance and behavior to whatever circumstances required. And then, after nearly 2 months of desperate flight, after facing death a dozen times, after enduring suffering that would have broken most people, Harriet Tubman crossed into Pennsylvania, into free territory, into a place where the law recognized her as a person rather than property. The moment should have been pure triumph, but instead, Harriet later described it as profoundly bittersweet. I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. But there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land. She was free, but she was also alone, separated from everyone she loved, carrying a freedom that felt incomplete because it wasn't shared. What does freedom mean when the people you love most in the world remain in chains? What is the value of personal liberation when your family, your community, your people remain in bondage? Harriet settled in Philadelphia, finding work as a domestic servant and a cook, jobs that paid her real money for her labor for the first time in her life. The experience of being paid, of owning the fruits of her own work, of making decisions about how to spend her time and money was revolutionary. But it wasn't enough. Every dollar she earned, every moment of freedom she experienced, reminded her of her family still enslaved in Maryland. She began to make inquiries about the Underground Railroad, about the networks of people who helped fugitives escape. She met William Still, a free black man who served as chairman of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee and who kept detailed records of the fugitives who passed through his care.
She met other conductors on the Underground Railroad, learned their methods and strategies, studied their successes and failures. And then, just a year after her own escape, Harriet made a decision that would have seemed insane to most people. She would return to Maryland, to slave territory, to the place where she was still legally considered fugitive property, and she would guide others to freedom. Her first rescue mission was personal. She went back for her niece, Kessia, and Kessia's 2 children, who were about to be sold at auction. Using money she'd saved from her work in Philadelphia and assistance from the Underground Railroad network, Harriet helped Kessia's free husband purchase his wife and children at auction, then guided them north to freedom. The mission was successful, and Harriet discovered something crucial about herself. She was exceptionally good at this kind of work. Her sleeping episodes, her visions, her intimate knowledge of Maryland's landscape, her fearlessness born of having nothing left to lose, all of it combined to make her an extraordinarily effective conductor. She returned again and again to Maryland over the next decade, making an estimated 13 trips into slave territory, personally guiding approximately 70 enslaved people to freedom. But her influence extended far beyond those she personally guided. She provided detailed instructions to dozens more who successfully escaped using the routes and methods she described, and her reputation as someone who never lost a passenger became legendary, inspiring countless others to attempt their own escapes. The work was dangerous beyond description. Maryland and other slave states had increased penalties for helping fugitives escape, with severe prison sentences or even death for those convicted of slave stealing. Slave catchers became more sophisticated in their methods, using better tracking techniques and offering larger rewards for fugitives. And as Harriet's reputation grew, so did the bounty on her head, eventually reaching $40,000, an enormous sum that made her one of the most wanted fugitives in America. But Harriet had advantages that her enemies consistently underestimated. First, she was a black woman, and the racist assumptions of the time meant that white people couldn't imagine a black woman possessing the intelligence, courage, and strategic capability required for her missions. They were looking for a male leader, for someone fitting their stereotypes of what dangerous fugitives looked like, and Harriet's appearance, a small woman just 5 feet tall, often disguised as an old person or a man, allowed her to move through spaces where she would have been recognized and captured if she'd matched their expectations. Second, she used psychological warfare with brilliant effectiveness. She carried a pistol and made it clear to the people she was guiding that there would be no turning back. Anyone who tried to return out of fear would be forced to continue at gunpoint, because a captured fugitive who knew the routes and safe houses would be tortured until they revealed that information, endangering everyone in the network. This absolute commitment to completing every mission, no matter the obstacles, created a success rate that was unmatched among Underground Railroad conductors. Third, she relied on deep spiritual conviction that gave her a kind of certainty and calm that others found almost supernatural. When she had visions showing her which path to take, she followed them without hesitation, and those visions consistently led her group away from patrols and toward safety. Whether you interpret this as divine guidance or as her unconscious mind processing information and pattern recognition at a level beyond normal awareness, the practical effect was the same. She made decisions with confidence that inspired trust in those following her. But perhaps her greatest advantage was her motivation. Other conductors were driven by noble principles, by abolitionist conviction, by moral outrage at slavery's injustice. Harriet was driven by all of that, but also by something more personal and powerful: love for her family, determination to reunite with those she'd left behind, absolute refusal to accept that freedom could be complete while her people remained in bondage. On one mission, she successfully guided her brother Moses and 2 other men to freedom. On another, she brought out her brother Robert, his wife, and their children. Each successful mission gave her more confidence, more knowledge of the routes and safe houses, more understanding of the psychology of both fugitives and pursuers. But one mission haunted her, one failure that she would carry for the rest of her life. She could not convince her husband John to come north with her. When she returned to Maryland specifically to bring John to freedom, she discovered that he had remarried, had built a life with a new wife, had chosen to stay in the world he knew rather than risk the unknown with Harriet. The betrayal, Though legally John had every right to remarry, believing Harriet was likely dead or permanently gone, cut deeper than any physical injury she'd ever sustained. She left Maryland that time without John, her heart broken but her resolve unshaken. If her husband wouldn't come, if her own marriage had been sacrificed to her mission, then she would pour all of that love and commitment into bringing others to freedom. Could anyone truly understand the cost of her choices? Could any calculation measure what she sacrificed? Personal happiness, safety, the simple pleasure of living without constant danger to pursue this mission. The most dangerous mission Harriet ever attempted was also the most personal, bringing her parents to freedom.
Ben and Rit were old, in their 70s, with health problems that made the difficult journey north seem nearly impossible. But in 1857, her father Ben was in danger of prosecution for helping enslaved people escape, and Harriet knew she had to act. She couldn't simply guide her parents along the usual routes. They were too old and frail to walk 90 miles through wilderness, to sleep in swamps and woods, to endure the hardships that younger fugitives could survive. Instead, Harriet devised a plan that demonstrated her strategic brilliance and her willingness to take extraordinary risks for family. She built a crude wheeled vehicle, something between a wagon and a cart, and literally wheeled her elderly parents north, using back roads and less traveled paths, relying on the network of safe houses to provide shelter and food, adapting the journey to their limitations rather than expecting them to adapt to the journey's usual demands. The mission took weeks and required resources beyond what Harriet could provide alone. The Underground Railroad network rallied to help, providing money, transportation, and safe houses specifically designed to accommodate elderly fugitives. The journey was agonizing. There were moments when her parents' health seemed to fail, when pursuit came so close that capture seemed certain, when Harriet herself wondered if she had undertaken something impossible. But she succeeded. She brought Ben and Rit to freedom, reunited them with children they hadn't seen in years, gave them the opportunity to spend their final years as free people, rather than as property. When they arrived in Canada, where Harriet had established them in a community of formerly enslaved people, her father said something that captured both the joy and sorrow of the moment. "I never thought I'd live to see this day. I never thought I'd die a free man." The reunion with her parents was joyful, but it also brought into sharp relief the painful reality of who was still missing. Harriet had brought out her parents, several of her brothers, her niece, and her niece's children, but some of her siblings remained in slavery, including her sister Rachel and Rachel's children. Harriet made multiple attempts to rescue them, but circumstances, increased surveillance, betrayals by people she'd trusted, pure bad luck prevented her from completing that mission. Rachel died in slavery before Harriet could reach her, and that loss became a weight Harriet carried for the rest of her life. She had saved dozens of people, had reunited much of her family, had accomplished things that seemed impossible, but she couldn't save Rachel, couldn't keep that promise to herself that she would free everyone she loved. The grief was profound, but Harriet channeled it into continued action. If she couldn't save Rachel, she would save Rachel's children if they ever got the chance to escape.
If she couldn't free her sister, she would free other sisters, other mothers, other daughters being torn from their families by the slave system. Between 1850 and 1860, Harriet Tubman became one of the most active and successful conductors on the Underground Railroad. She developed a reputation that was legendary among both the enslaved people who dreamed of freedom and the slaveholders who feared her. They called her Moses, after the biblical figure who led the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt. The comparison was apt. She was leading her people to freedom, parting the metaphorical Red Sea of the slave system, delivering them to a promised land in the North and in Canada. But unlike the biblical Moses, Harriet didn't just point the way and send others on the journey. She personally guided each group, walked every step with them, shared every danger and hardship. Her commitment was absolute. Her courage was boundless, and her success rate was perfect. She never lost a passenger, never had a mission end in capture. The slaveholders' hatred of her was matched only by their inability to stop her. They increased the bounty on her head. They improved their patrols and tracking methods. They set traps and ambushes. But Harriet seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to evade capture, to sense danger before it materialized, to find paths that her pursuers couldn't follow. Part of this was skill and knowledge. Part was the advantage of being underestimated because of racist and sexist assumptions. Part was the support of the Underground Railroad network. And part, Harriet believed with absolute conviction, was divine protection. God guiding her steps, warning her of danger, showing her the way when the path seemed impossible to find. Her faith wasn't the passive acceptance that some slaveholders tried to instill in enslaved people, the Christianity of submission and obedience. Her faith was active, demanding, insistent. She believed that God wanted people to be free, that slavery was an abomination, that her work was holy work, and that divine protection came to those who did God's will. This combination of practical skill and spiritual conviction made her nearly unstoppable. And as the 1850s progressed and the nation moved closer to civil war over the question of slavery, Harriet's work took on new significance and new urgency. But could even someone as capable and committed as Harriet continue this dangerous work indefinitely? Could anyone sustain such constant risk, such relentless pressure, such repeated trauma without eventually breaking? The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 changed the landscape for freedom seekers and those who helped them. Before the act, enslaved people who reached free states had at least some protection under those states' laws. But the new federal law required that fugitives be returned to slavery even from free states, made it a crime to help fugitives escape, and created financial incentives for capturing people suspected of being runaways. The law meant that nowhere in the United States was truly safe for fugitives. It meant that Harriet and the people she guided had to travel all the way to Canada to find legal protection. It meant that the journeys became longer, more dangerous, more expensive, and more difficult. But it also radicalized the abolitionist movement and strengthened the Underground Railroad network. White abolitionists who had previously taken moderate positions became willing to break the law to help fugitives. Free black communities in the North became more organized in their resistance. Churches, both black and white, became stations on the Underground Railroad despite the legal risks. Harriet adapted to the new reality by extending her roots into Canada, establishing communities there where formerly enslaved people could settle safely. She worked with Frederick Douglass, the famous formerly enslaved orator and abolitionist, who later wrote about meeting her, "I have had the applause of the crowd and the satisfaction that comes of being approved by the multitude, while the most that you have done has been witnessed by a few trembling, scarred, and footsore bondmen and women whom you have led out of the house of bondage. The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom and of your heroism." She met John Brown, the radical abolitionist who believed that slavery would only end through violent uprising. Brown called her General Tubman and consulted with her about his planned raid on Harper's Ferry, hoping to use the armory there to arm enslaved people for a massive rebellion. Harriet supported his goals, but didn't participate in the raid. She was ill at the time, and some historians believe her visions had warned her that the raid would fail. When Brown's raid did fail and he was captured and hanged, Harriet mourned him as a martyred hero. She understood that his method had failed, but respected his willingness to die for the cause of freedom. She told people, "It was not John Brown that died at Charleston, it was Christ." As the 1860 election approached and the nation moved toward civil war, Harriet's work continued. She made her last mission into slave territory in December 1860, bringing out 7 people, including a baby who had to be drugged with paregoric to keep it quiet during the dangerous passages through towns and past patrols. The mission was successful, but Harriet later said it was one of the most difficult she'd ever attempted, with multiple close calls and narrow escapes. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Harriet saw it as God's judgment on a nation that had permitted slavery, as the inevitable reckoning for centuries of injustice. She immediately wanted to contribute to the war effort, to help destroy the system she'd been fighting against her entire adult life. In 1862, she traveled to South Carolina to work with the Union Army. Her role initially was as a nurse, caring for formerly enslaved people who had fled to Union lines and for black soldiers who were beginning to be recruited into the Army. But her unique skills, her knowledge of Southern terrain, her ability to move through hostile territory, her experience with covert operations, her rapport with enslaved people who might provide intelligence, soon led to her being recruited for more specialized work. Harriet Tubman became a spy and scout for the Union Army, the first woman to lead an armed expedition in the war. She gathered intelligence about Confederate troop movements and supply lines, guided Union soldiers through difficult terrain, and helped plan military operations. Her most famous military action was the Combahee River Raid in June 1863, where she guided 3 Union gunboats up the Combahee River in South Carolina, navigating past Confederate mines and leading a raid that destroyed plantations and liberated more than 700 enslaved people. The raid was a stunning military success, but more importantly, it was a massive blow to the slave system in that region. 700 people who had been property were suddenly free, guided to Union lines by a woman who had once been property herself. The symbolism was powerful, the enslaved liberating the enslaved, the formerly powerless wielding military power against their former oppressors. Harriet's work during the Civil War was dangerous and exhausting. She suffered from the effects of her old head injury, experiencing sleeping episodes and seizures at times that could have been fatal if they'd occurred during combat operations. She worked without adequate compensation. The Army paid black scouts and spies far less than white ones, and Harriet often had to support herself by selling pies and root beer to soldiers. But she persevered, driven by the same commitment that had motivated her Underground Railroad work, the absolute conviction that freedom was worth any sacrifice, that the destruction of slavery justified any hardship she had to endure. When the war ended in 1865 and slavery was finally, legally, permanently abolished, Harriet must have felt a complex mix of emotions. Triumph at seeing the system she'd fought against destroyed. Grief for the hundreds of thousands who had died in the war, including many of the black soldiers she'd worked alongside. Relief that the desperate, dangerous work of the Underground Railroad was no longer necessary. And perhaps a sense of disorientation. She had spent her entire adult life fighting slavery, and now that fight was over, at least in its most basic form. What does a freedom fighter do when the specific battle that defined her life is over?
How does someone who has lived with constant danger and purpose adjust to a world where that danger and purpose no longer exist in the same form? After the war, Harriet should have been celebrated as a hero, compensated for her military service, honored for her contributions to the Union victory. Instead, she faced bureaucratic indifference and the systemic sexism and racism that devalued the contributions of black women. The Army refused to pay her properly for her service, claiming that her work as a scout and spy hadn't been officially authorized, despite the fact that she had worked under direct orders from Union officers. For decades, Harriet fought for the military pension she was owed, submitting testimonies from officers she'd served under, documenting her service, appealing to Congress. She was eventually granted a small pension, but only as the widow of Nelson Davis, a black Union soldier she'd married in 1869, not for her own military service. The injustice of this must have been profound, but Harriet didn't let bitterness consume her. She had fought too many battles, overcome too many obstacles to be stopped by bureaucratic injustice. She settled in Auburn, New York, on property she'd purchased before the war, with help from abolitionist supporters. She opened her home to family members, to formerly enslaved people who needed assistance, to anyone who needed shelter or help. Her home became an informal community center, a place where the formerly enslaved could find support as they built free lives. Harriet also became involved in the women's suffrage movement, speaking at conventions alongside Susan Anthony and other leaders of the movement. She understood that the fight for freedom didn't end with the abolition of slavery, that black women still faced oppression based on both their race and their gender, that the vote was crucial to achieving full citizenship and equality. In her speeches for women's suffrage, Harriet connected the struggles. "I was a conductor on the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. Just as I helped free my people from slavery, now we must free women from the bondage of being denied their rights." She also worked to establish a home for elderly, formerly enslaved people, understanding that many who had been freed in old age had no family support, no resources, no place to go. The Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged opened in 1908, providing care and dignity to people who had spent most of their lives in bondage and deserved to spend their final years in comfort and respect. Harriet's later life was marked by chronic illness stemming from her old head injury and from the hardships she'd endured during her years on the Underground Railroad and during the war.
She underwent brain surgery in the 1890s to try to alleviate her symptoms, refusing anesthesia and instead biting down on a bullet during the operation, just as she'd seen soldiers do during the war. The surgery provided some relief, but she continued to suffer from seizures and sleeping episodes for the rest of her life. Despite her physical challenges, Harriet remained mentally sharp and spiritually strong. She told stories about her life to anyone who would listen, understanding that her experiences were history, that they needed to be preserved and passed down. She worked with Sarah Bradford, a white writer, who published a biography of Harriet in 1869, with the proceeds going to Harriet to help support her charitable work. In her old age, Harriet reflected on her life with a combination of satisfaction and sorrow. She had saved approximately 70 people personally, had provided guidance that helped dozens more escape, had served her country during the war, had contributed to the destruction of slavery. But she also carried the weight of those she couldn't save, particularly her sister Rachel, and the knowledge that while legal slavery had ended, true equality and freedom remained elusive goals for Black Americans. She spoke often about her faith, attributing her survival and success to divine guidance. "I always told God, I'm going to hold steady on to you, and you've got to see me through." That steady holding, that absolute trust in divine purpose had sustained her through trials that would have destroyed most people. Harriet also spoke about freedom in ways that went beyond legal status. "There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. For no man should take me alive. I should fight for my liberty as my strength lasted, and when the time came for me to go, the Lord would let them take me." In 1913, Harriet Tubman died at approximately 91 years old. The exact age was uncertain because, like so many enslaved people, her birth had not been recorded with precision. She died at the Home for the Aged that she had founded, surrounded by family and friends who had gathered to honor a woman they knew was extraordinary, even if the wider world had not yet fully recognized her contributions. Her funeral was a military ceremony, with honors accorded to her service during the Civil War. The Black community of Auburn turned out in force to honor their hero. Veterans of Black Civil War regiments served as pallbearers. The ceremony was a recognition that, while the government had been slow to acknowledge her contributions, the people whose lives she'd touched and whose freedom she'd fought for would never forget. Could anyone truly measure the impact of one person's courage? Could any calculation capture the ripple effects of 70 people freed, who went on to have children and grandchildren who lived in freedom because Harriet had risked everything to guide their ancestors north? The legacy of Harriet Tubman is complex and multifaceted, extending far beyond the specific acts of heroism that defined her active years. She represents something essential about the human spirit's capacity for courage, about the power of love to motivate extraordinary sacrifice, about the possibility of one person making a genuine difference even when facing overwhelming systemic opposition. Her story challenges the narrative that enslaved people were passive victims waiting for white abolitionists to free them. Harriet was an active agent in her own liberation and in the liberation of others. She didn't wait for the system to change. She undermined it, defied it, helped destroy it through direct action. Her intelligence, strategic thinking, and courage were as crucial to the anti-slavery cause as the speeches of Frederick Douglass or the political maneuvering of Abraham Lincoln. Her story also complicates easy narratives about freedom and family. Harriet's freedom came at tremendous personal cost: a failed marriage, years of separation from her parents and siblings, the death of her sister before she could be rescued. Her choice to repeatedly return to slave territory, risking the freedom she'd won, demonstrates a moral courage that goes beyond simple self-preservation. She understood that freedom was not truly freedom if it was hoarded rather than shared, if it was personal rather than collective. The methods Harriet used, deception, disguise, strategic manipulation of white people's racist assumptions, willingness to use violence when necessary to protect fugitives, challenge sanitized versions of resistance that focus only on nonviolent civil disobedience. Harriet was committed to liberation by any means necessary, and while she preferred to avoid violence, she was prepared to use it when the alternative was allowing people she was guiding to be returned to slavery. Her spiritual conviction challenges secular narratives that dismiss faith as mere superstition or opiate. For Harriet, her relationship with God was the source of her courage, the foundation of her certainty that she was doing righteous work, the reason she could face death repeatedly without losing her nerve. Whether you interpret her visions as divine communication or as her unconscious mind processing information in ways that appeared supernatural, the practical effect was undeniable. They gave her confidence and guidance that saved lives. Her later work for women's suffrage demonstrated that she understood liberation as an ongoing process rather than a single achievement. Abolishing slavery was crucial, but it wasn't sufficient for full freedom and equality. Black women still faced oppression based on race and gender, still needed the vote, still needed economic opportunity, still needed the full recognition of their humanity and rights. The decades after Harriet's death saw her reputation grow as historians began to fully document her contributions. But that recognition was slow and uneven, hampered by the same racism and sexism that had denied her proper compensation during her lifetime. It wasn't until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s that Harriet began to be widely recognized as the American hero she was, her story taught in schools, her image becoming iconic. Even then, the recognition often came with sanitization, the violence of slavery downplayed, Harriet's willingness to use force forgotten, the complexity of her choices and the cost of her sacrifices simplified into a heroic narrative that sometimes obscured the very real trauma and pain she endured and inflicted when necessary to protect those she was guiding to freedom. Today, Harriet Tubman is recognized as one of the most important figures in American history. There are monuments to her, schools named after her, plans to feature her on U.S. currency. These honors are deserved, but they also raise questions. How do we honor someone like Harriet without sanitizing her story, without turning her into a comfortable symbol rather than the radical freedom fighter she actually was? How do we remember her courage without forgetting the systemic injustices that made such courage necessary?
Perhaps the best way to honor Harriet is not through monuments, but through continuing the work she began, the work of liberation, of fighting against systems that dehumanize people, of refusing to accept injustice even when resistance seems futile, of risking comfort and safety to help others find freedom. Harriet's story asks us difficult questions. What would we risk for freedom? What would we sacrifice to help others escape oppression? How much courage do we have when the cost of resistance is high and the chance of success seems low? These aren't just historical questions. They're questions each generation must answer in the context of their own struggles against injustice, their own encounters with systems that deny human dignity, their own choices about whether to accept oppression or fight against it. There's a particular moment in Harriet's story that deserves deeper reflection, the moment when she crossed into Pennsylvania and experienced freedom for the first time, only to realize that the joy was incomplete because her family remained in bondage.
That moment captures something essential about the nature of true freedom. It cannot be fully enjoyed in isolation. It demands to be shared. It creates an obligation to help others achieve what you have achieved. Many fugitives from slavery, once they reached free territory, stayed there, built lives, tried to create safety and stability after years of trauma and danger. No one would have blamed Harriet for doing the same. She'd earned her freedom, had risked everything to claim it, deserved to enjoy it without constantly risking recapture and death. But Harriet couldn't accept a freedom that was hers alone. Her personal liberation created an obligation, a calling, a mission that she couldn't ignore. Every day she spent in freedom while her family remained enslaved was a day of incomplete joy, partial victory, unfinished work. This understanding of freedom as collective rather than individual, as obligation rather than possession, sets Harriet apart and makes her story relevant to every struggle for justice. She understood that systems of oppression don't fall because individuals escape them. They fall because enough people refuse to accept them, because the oppressed organize and resist, because those who achieve freedom extend their hands to help others climb out of bondage. Her willingness to return to Maryland again and again, risking the freedom she'd won, demonstrates a kind of love that transcends self-preservation. It's the love that parents have for children, that motivates soldiers to run toward danger to save their comrades, that drives people to sacrifice their own comfort and safety for abstract principles like justice and dignity. But it's important to acknowledge that this kind of love came at tremendous cost. Harriet lived with constant danger for more than a decade. She suffered from chronic health problems related to her head injury and the physical hardships of her Underground Railroad work. She endured poverty, working for years without adequate compensation. She lost her marriage, lost years with her parents, lost the simple pleasures of a peaceful life. The question her story raises is not whether we should all become Harriet Tubman. Very few people possess her particular combination of skills, courage, and calling. The question is, what is our version of going back for others? What does it mean to refuse to hoard freedom, to recognize that our liberation is incomplete while others remain oppressed? For some, it might mean literal rescue work, helping immigrants escape persecution, working to free people from human trafficking, supporting those fleeing domestic violence. For others, it might mean using privilege and resources to fight systemic injustice, advocating for policy changes, supporting grassroots movements, using platforms to amplify marginalized voices. For still others, it might mean the quieter but essential work of building community, providing support and shelter, creating spaces where people can heal and organize. Harriet's story doesn't prescribe a specific path. It reveals a principle, that true freedom creates obligation, that those who have escaped oppression have a responsibility to help others escape, that liberation is not a personal achievement, but a collective project that requires ongoing commitment and sacrifice. This principle applies to struggles far beyond the historical context of American slavery. It applies to fights against all forms of oppression, racism, sexism, homophobia, economic exploitation, political tyranny, environmental destruction. In each case, the question is the same. Will those who have some measure of freedom and safety use it to help others, or will they protect their own comfort at the expense of collective liberation? Harriet answered that question with her life, and in doing so, she created a template for moral courage that remains relevant more than a century after her death. As we approach the end of Harriet's story, it's worth reflecting on what made her different from the thousands of other enslaved people who dreamed of freedom but never attempted escape, or who attempted it once and failed. What was it about Harriet that allowed her to accomplish what seemed impossible? Part of the answer is certainly her exceptional intelligence and strategic thinking. She had a mind that could process complex information, identify patterns, plan multiple steps ahead, adapt quickly to changing circumstances. These cognitive gifts were crucial to her success. Part of the answer is her physical courage and high pain tolerance. She had endured tremendous suffering from childhood and had learned to function through pain, exhaustion, and danger that would have incapacitated most people. Her ability to push her body beyond normal limits was essential to surviving the hardships of escape and rescue missions. Part of the answer is her spiritual conviction, her absolute faith that God was guiding her, protecting her, using her for a holy purpose gave her a confidence and fearlessness that had practical benefits. When you believe you're doing God's work, you can face dangers that would paralyze someone operating on merely human courage. Part of the answer is luck and timing. She escaped during a period when the Underground Railroad was well established, when there were networks of people willing to help. She lived in Maryland, which bordered free states, making escape geographically possible. She survived injuries and illnesses that killed many others. Not all of her success can be attributed to her own actions. Circumstance and fortune played roles. But perhaps the most important factor was something less tangible, an absolute refusal to accept bondage, a bone-deep certainty of her own humanity and right to freedom that no amount of brutality could destroy. This wasn't something Harriet chose, it was something she was. From childhood, she knew she was a person, not property. That knowledge, maintained against all the evidence and messaging of the slave system, was her greatest weapon. The slave system depended on convincing enslaved people that they were inferior, that they were born for bondage, that resistance was futile. Those who internalized this messaging became easier to control, less likely to risk escape, more likely to police other enslaved people on behalf of the masters. But those who rejected it, who maintained an inner conviction of their own worth and right to freedom, became dangerous to the entire system. Harriet was dangerous from childhood. Every beating she endured that didn't break her spirit made her more dangerous. Every escape attempt, even the failed ones, reinforced her conviction that she would someday be free. Every day she survived taught her something that would later be useful. By the time she made her successful escape at age 27, she had accumulated a lifetime of knowledge about how slavery worked, how to navigate its systems, how to exploit its weaknesses, and she had developed an unshakable conviction that freedom was her birthright, that she would claim it or die trying. That conviction, more than any single skill or advantage, is what made her Harriet Tubman. And that conviction is what made her return to Maryland not once, but 13 times, risking everything repeatedly to bring others to freedom. Understanding this helps us understand what her story asks of us. We may not face the same circumstances Harriet faced. We may not be called to risk our lives in the same ways, but the principle remains. Do we know deep in our bones that we deserve freedom and dignity? And does that knowledge create in us a conviction that others deserve the same, a conviction strong enough to motivate sacrifice and action? These are the questions Harriet's life poses to every generation, to every person who encounters her story. And the answers we give through our actions rather than just our words determine whether we are truly her inheritors or merely her admirers. In Harriet's final years, as she sat on the porch of the home she'd established for elderly, formerly enslaved people, surrounded by people she'd helped free and support, she must have reflected on the arc of her life with complex emotions. Pride in what she'd accomplished, certainly. 70 people personally guided to freedom, hundreds more influenced by her example, a military career that contributed to the Union victory, decades of advocacy for women's suffrage and rights for the formerly enslaved. But also grief for what was lost. Her sister Rachel, who died before Harriet could rescue her. Her first marriage destroyed by the incompatible dreams of a free man and an enslaved woman determined to claim her freedom. Years of her life spent in constant danger rather than the peace and security that most people take for granted. The chronic pain and disability from her head injury that plagued her until death. And perhaps a kind of existential exhaustion. The weariness that comes from fighting for so long, from carrying so much responsibility, from being Harriet Tubman rather than just Araminta Ross, a woman who might have lived a quieter life if circumstances and her own nature had allowed it. But alongside the grief and exhaustion, there must have been profound satisfaction. She had proven that one person could make a difference, that intelligence and courage could overcome enormous structural advantages, that love was more powerful than hate, that freedom could be claimed rather than merely granted. She had seen slavery destroyed, had watched the system that had brutalized her and millions of others finally collapse under the weight of its own contradictions and the resistance of enslaved people and their allies. She had lived to see black men vote, black communities organize, formerly enslaved people building lives of dignity and purpose. It wasn't complete victory. She knew that racism persisted, that economic exploitation continued, that black Americans still faced tremendous obstacles to achieving true equality. But it was progress, real and undeniable progress, and she had contributed to that progress in ways that would echo through generations. When Harriet died in 1913, she was buried with military honors, her casket carried by black veterans of the Civil War, her passing mourned by communities that understood they had lost someone extraordinary. The funeral was both a celebration of her life and a recognition that her work was unfinished, that the struggle for freedom and justice would continue long after she was gone. In the century since her death, Harriet's reputation has only grown. She has become an icon, a symbol of courage and resistance, her image recognized around the world. Schools, museums, monuments, and cultural works celebrate her life and contributions. Plans to feature her on U.S. currency represent a kind of official recognition that would have seemed impossible during her lifetime, when the government refused to properly compensate her for her military service. But Harriet's true legacy isn't in monuments or currency or official recognition. Her true legacy is in the lives she saved and the lives of their descendants, in the example she set for generations of freedom fighters, in the principles she embodied that one person, armed with courage and conviction, can challenge systems of oppression and win. Her legacy is in every person who refuses to accept injustice, who risks comfort and safety to help others, who understands that freedom is collective rather than individual. Her legacy is in the continued struggle for equality and dignity, in the movements that draw inspiration from her example, in the understanding that liberation is always unfinished work requiring ongoing commitment. When we tell Harriet's story today, we're not just recounting historical facts. We're preserving a template for moral courage that each generation must learn and apply to their own struggles. We're remembering that systems of oppression, no matter how powerful they seem, can be undermined by people who refuse to submit to them. We're honoring the principle that some things, freedom, dignity, human connection, are worth any sacrifice. And we're asking ourselves the question that Harriet's life poses to all who encounter it. When our moment comes, when we face our own choice between safety and justice, between personal comfort and collective liberation, what will we choose? Will we have even a fraction of Harriet's courage? Will we be willing to risk what she risked, to sacrifice what she sacrificed, to love as fiercely and fight as tirelessly as she did? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're challenges that history places before each of us, demanding answers not in words, but in actions. Harriet answered with her life. What will our answer be? There's a photograph of Harriet Tubman, taken sometime in the 1860s or 1870s, that has become iconic. She sits upright, her gaze direct and unflinching, her expression serious and dignified. She's wearing a white shirt and a dark jacket, her hair is covered, and there's something in her eyes, a depth, a knowing, a strength that seems to reach across time and demand recognition. When you look at that photograph, you're looking at someone who had endured horrors you can barely imagine and accomplished feats that seem almost superhuman. You're looking at someone who had been beaten, exploited, dehumanized, and who nonetheless maintained absolute conviction in her own humanity and worth. You're looking at someone who had risked death dozens of times and never flinched, who had lost people she loved and continued fighting, who had suffered chronic pain and disability and refused to be diminished by it. But you're also looking at someone who was fundamentally human. Harriet wasn't superhuman. She was a person who faced extraordinary circumstances with extraordinary courage, but who also experienced fear, doubt, grief, and pain. She made difficult choices, endured terrible losses, carried scars both visible and invisible. Understanding her humanity, not just her heroism, but her vulnerability, not just her strength, but her suffering, is crucial to truly honoring her legacy. Because if we remember Harriet as superhuman, as someone whose courage and capability were so far beyond normal human capacity that we couldn't hope to emulate them, then her example becomes inspiration without obligation. We can admire her without feeling called to action. But if we remember her as human, as someone who was afraid but acted anyway, who doubted but persevered, who suffered but refused to be broken, then her example becomes a challenge. If she, a person born into slavery, denied education and opportunity, exploited and brutalized from childhood, could find the courage to resist and the strength to help others resist, what's our excuse for accepting injustice? This is perhaps the most uncomfortable aspect of Harriet's legacy. It demands something from us. It asks us to examine our own courage, our own commitment to justice, our own willingness to sacrifice comfort and safety for principles that matter. It asks us to consider what we would do if we were in her circumstances, and more pointedly, what we are doing in our own circumstances, where we might have opportunities to fight injustice that we're choosing not to take. Harriet's story is inspiring, but it's also convicting. It reveals both the heights of which humans are capable and the depths to which systems of oppression can fall. It shows us what one person can accomplish, and in doing so, it removes our excuses for inaction. The challenges we face today are different from those Harriet faced. Legal slavery has been abolished, though its legacies persist in systemic racism, mass incarceration, economic inequality, and countless other ways. But the principle remains the same. There are people suffering under oppressive systems, and those of us with some measure of freedom and power have a choice about whether to use that freedom and power to help others or to hoard it for ourselves. Harriet chose to share her freedom, to risk it repeatedly to bring others to liberty. That choice wasn't required of her. She'd earned her freedom through tremendous suffering and risk. She could have stayed in Philadelphia or Canada, built a peaceful life, enjoyed the liberty she'd claimed. No one would have blamed her. But she couldn't accept a freedom that was hers alone while her family and her people remained in bondage. Her love was too strong, her conviction too deep, her understanding that liberation must be collective rather than individual too complete. What would it mean to live by that principle today? What would it mean to refuse to hoard freedom, to recognize that our liberation is incomplete while others suffer oppression? To use whatever privileges and resources we have to fight for collective justice rather than merely individual comfort? These are the questions Harriet's life asks us, and they're not comfortable questions because answering them honestly requires examining our choices, our priorities, our willingness to sacrifice for others. But perhaps discomfort is precisely the point. Perhaps Harriet's legacy is meant to disturb us, to challenge us, to refuse to let us be comfortable with injustice or satisfied with partial freedom. Perhaps her story is meant to haunt us until we act. As we close Harriet's story, let us return to where we began, with a question about sacrifice and courage. Harriet Tubman sacrificed personal safety, family relationships, physical health, and financial security to pursue freedom for herself and others. She risked death repeatedly, endured chronic pain and disability, lived with constant danger for years. Why? What drove her to make these choices when easier paths were available? The answer, at its core, is love. Love for her family, love for her people, love for the principle of human freedom and dignity. Love that was strong enough to overcome fear, to endure suffering, to persist when success seemed impossible. But it was also something else, an absolute refusal to accept dehumanization, a conviction that she was born for freedom and would claim it or die trying, an understanding that true freedom is collective rather than individual. These motivations, love and conviction, compassion and principle, are what made Harriet Tubman who she was, and they're what her legacy calls us to cultivate in ourselves. We honor Harriet not primarily through monuments and commemorations, though those have their place. We honor her by embodying the principles she lived by: courage in the face of injustice, commitment to collective liberation, willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for the freedom and dignity of others. We honor her by refusing to accept systems of oppression, by using whatever skills and resources we have to undermine those systems, by extending our hands to help others climb toward freedom. We honor her by remembering that she was human, that her courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear, that her strength was not invulnerability, but the refusal to be broken by vulnerability. We honor her by telling her story truthfully, without sanitizing the violence she endured and was willing to use when necessary, without minimizing the cost of her choices, without pretending that fighting for justice is easy or comfortable. And we honor her by continuing the work she began, because while legal slavery has ended, the struggle for true freedom and equality continues. Systemic racism, economic exploitation, gender-based oppression, and countless other injustices persist. The work of liberation is unfinished. Harriet Tubman showed us what one person can accomplish. She proved that intelligence, courage and love can overcome enormous structural advantages. She demonstrated that freedom is worth any sacrifice and that true freedom must be shared rather than hoarded. Her life asks us, what will you do with the freedom you have? How will you use whatever privileges and resources you possess? When your moment comes to choose between safety and justice, what will you choose? These are not hypothetical questions. They're choices we face every day in large and small ways, and the answers we give through our actions rather than merely our words determine whether we are truly Harriet's inheritors or merely her admirers. Remember her name. Remember her courage. Remember that she was fully human, and that her humanity, with all its fear and strength, its suffering and triumph, is what made her extraordinary. Remember Harriet Tubman, who escaped chains, lost her family in the pursuit of their freedom, and led hundreds of others from bondage to liberty. Remember that she never lost a passenger, never stopped fighting, never accepted that injustice was inevitable. And in remembering, commit yourself to continuing her work in whatever form that takes in your own time and place, because her legacy is not just inspiration, it's obligation. It's a call to action that echoes across time, demanding that each generation take up the work of liberation and carry it forward. This is how we truly honor her, not with statues alone, but with lives lived in service of the principles she embodied. Not with words alone, but with actions that challenge injustice and extend freedom to others. Harriet Tubman's story is not just history, it's a light showing us the way forward, a challenge calling us to courage, a legacy demanding that we become worthy inheritors of the freedom she fought for. May we prove equal to that calling. May we find even a fraction of her courage. May we love freedom and justice as fiercely as she did. And may her memory be a blessing that inspires us to action, today and always. If Harriet Tubman's extraordinary story of courage, sacrifice, and love moved you, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with others. These stories of resilience and brilliance are part of our shared human heritage, and they deserve to be remembered, celebrated, and passed on to future generations. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories that illuminate the best of what humans can be when facing the worst of circumstances. Harriet's legacy lives on in everyone who refuses to accept injustice, and by sharing her story, you become part of keeping that legacy alive.